We're good.
All right. Well, thank you all for joining us tonight for our cocktail chat with Martin Weinstein. We are excited to have you here virtually. Of course, we have Martin's exhibition Moment to Moment on view at the South Dakota Art Museum now through November 7th. So if you are in our neck of the woods, please try to come out and check out the exhibition in person. Martin wasn't able to join us in person, so we're happy to do this virtually. I'm Jodi Lundgren. I'm the exhibitions curator for the museum, so happy to have Martin here to talk with us tonight. Happy to have his works on display at the museum to share with folks. I'm really excited to hear him talk about his works directly because I have not had the chance to do that yet, but I fell in love with Martin's work almost immediately. I think it's just such a unique way to address the landscape and really quite literally a different, presenting a different way for us to experience time and space in relationship to landscape. So I think it's pretty revelatory and it really kind of instructional for people too to understand these kind of complex layers and questions with landscape practice just through experiencing it so differently. So I will not spend too much time talking. Feel free to throw questions into the chat box at any point if you have them. Hopefully towards the end too, we'll have a chance for folks who maybe chat box is a little difficult to just unmute and throw some questions out to Martin if you have any left that are unanswered. But with that, I will go ahead and pass it over to Martin to share with us some things about his practice.
Hi.
Thank you.
So, I'm
¿Cómo estás? Muy bien. ¿Y tú? ¿Y tú? Felicidades, felicidades.
Hello?
Yeah.
There we go.
Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I'm very happy to be showing at the museum, and I'm not sure how. I'm assuming that everybody who's in, has joined us knows the work somewhat. So I think I'll start right now, with some images to show the evolution of the work to where it is now. I should explain that I was an abstract painter. My father was an artist, more of an art teacher, really. That was what his degree was in. And so I was exposed to it, an art education from an early age, pretty early age to be life drawing and, all of the regular. He had taught briefly at the École des Beaux-Arts, actually. After World War II, he taught classes for ex-servicemen there. And so, yeah, I started, I think, he gave me a set of oil paints when I was like 5 or 6. So it was, it's been pretty much nonstop ever since then. I should explain that he was an abstract painter and that I was sort of raised to be an abstract painter. And, that was sort of very much the feeling then that you were supposed to, learn to draw and then sort of forget about it. So, my art school, in art school, I was an abstract painter. And I'll start showing you some images. Can everyone see? Is that up on the screen?
Yes, looks great.
So this is a painting from the early 1980s. These paintings were big, color field sort of stained images. This one is 6 by 8 feet, Untitled. And I chose this one because it's at the end of a series of paintings where, if you can sort of see on the upper right-hand corner, I masked out part of it and there's another image underneath. So there's an effect of sort of looking through these images to, through a sort of network or lacework to something that's happening underneath. So that's a sort of beginning of this feeling of layering that's going to be the theme of my work.
And is this oil on canvas then?
It's acrylic.
Acrylic on canvas.
Yeah, on raw canvas. And, you know, even in these abstract paintings, but there's, you know, a lot of the natural world in them, you know. They're some hybrid of landscape and abstract painting. And this was a painting called Diagram. And I had started, I did a number of paintings with this sort of image of paintings flying around the studio. And on the right-hand side, part of it, a little sliver of it is gessoed and then painted in oil paint, you know, in a completely different style. So again, playing with layering, in this case, layering style rather than time. Again, this is acrylic. There's resist. There's, you know, a bunch of different techniques going on in it. It's from 1986, and it's 28 by 38. So all the time that I was doing abstract paintings, you know, for about maybe 10 years out of art school, all the time I was, you know, whenever I was traveling, I was doing watercolors or pastels. And I really love depicting. And part of it is also the whole experience of, you know, when you've sat in a place for an hour and stared at it and painted it, you never forget it. So for traveling, that's a wonderful thing. But also the sort of, it's a kind of adrenaline rush of, you know, something's in front of you and the light is changing and the sky is moving and you have to get it down and you can't, it sort of short circuits your thinking, you know, critical thinking in a sense to open you up to a more, yeah, a freer way of doing things. So this is a watercolor. It's Shelburne, Vermont. I have boxes and boxes of these. So as I went through the images, I just, you know, I picked a few just because it was sort of nice to look through them again. I very rarely do look at them. This is the Caribbean, Virgin Gorda, sunrise. These are all a combination of watercolor and gouache on a kind of prepared paper that a friend of mine in New York used to make. It's a watercolor paper that's prepared to be able to take pastel as well with a slight tooth to it. This is a lake in France, Lake Annecy. This is a farm in upstate New York, our friend DeGroot Farm. This is Positano in Italy. These are, you know, there's probably 20 years of these. And then this is one of a very early painting on plexiglass. I've always really liked painting on very smooth surfaces because I like the way the paint just sort of flies across. I've never been, you know, an impasto painter. I've always painted sort of thinly. I like sort of veils of color as with the staining. This is a painting of our place upstate. It was my parents' house. Now we share it with my brother. And it's years and years ago. It's 1996. Let me see. Yes, it's called Mays. So it's 3 different days in May, but the different times, the different days are next to each other. you know, as a sort of triptych. And I've painted some colors on the back and some colors on the front, but it's you know, one sheet of Plex painted on the back and the front. This is a pastel from traveling, and it's called 6 Days in Paris. We took my father-in-law to Paris when he was in his 80s, and we stayed in a hotel with this view. We didn't know how much he'd be able to get out. It turned out a lot, but you know, he'd be resting a lot in the room, and every day I did another piece of this. It's big. It's 39 by 57 inch drawing. And they're just all sort of dumped on top of each other, but it's the beginning of layering by putting things sort of on top of each other. And, you know, this is probably a good moment to explain that, you know, when I say I did this and then I did that, it all seems very intellectual and very calculated, but really it's just instinctual that now I have to do this, and I'm not happy with what I'm doing, and what's next? You know, and back then, you know, I think with a lot of artists, you know, these decisions became sort of agonizing. Oh, I hate what I'm doing, and I can't do it anymore. Now, you know, when that happens, I'm old enough to know that, you know, that always means something good is around the corner, and not to panic about it. It doesn't become an artist block. But, you know, I try to explain that because it's, a lot of times I think artist talks can seem like, you know, the artist really knows what they're doing, but I can't claim to really know what I'm doing. It's just what's next, and, you know. So this was what was next, a series of paintings. These are on layers of plexiglass. So there's 3 layers, which are 3 different times of the day. But I've sort of divided the room like a pie. And on the left of the painting, it's night. In the middle of the painting, it's afternoon. And the right of the painting is, I think, morning. And this painting is called The Mind's Heart, because it's, you know, all of my drawings sort of flying around. Like that earlier semi-abstract painting, it was an image that I used to do a lot of, these drawings flying around. And this painting was 1989, and I stopped doing this imagery because on 9/11, you know, we were in the city and we saw this happen. We're downtown. We saw this happening for real. All these papers from the towers flying around, and somehow something that had always seemed to me like a kind of joyous image became something horrible. And I've never picked up that again. You know, that's sort of what it means to me now. But there were a lot of paintings like this. I did come back, you'll see the last image I have, to images of the art in the studio, but it's very different. And this is a painting called Mutable Perception. This is on 2 layers of plexiglass. They were in oil. I was painting in oil on plexiglass back then. And this was a sort of one of those happy accidents. It's a small painting. It's, how big is it? It's 20 by 16. And I was painting these layers of this image of a window in my studio, and I had them laying around on the floor. And the toddler of a friend of ours put these 2 layers, put this layer of the window from further distance on top of the layer of the window closer up. And something about that seemed to me very meaningful. And that was it. That became that painting. It's something that I return to again and again, which is that, you know, in theory, you would be using these layers to create space, but this is a sort of reverse where you're using the layers to deny the space that the layer that's further away is on top and the layer that's a closer up view is underneath. And I should explain now probably that a lot of my work was influenced by, I decided, you know, when I was making the transition from being an abstract painter to a realistic painter, that I should, you know, do some research on what reality actually was. So I started reading a lot of physics. I had a book that a friend had given me called The Nature of the Physical World by Sir Arthur Eddington, which was like written in the 30s, but has a lot of, you know, he was a friend of Einstein's, and there's a lot about the fact that, you know, in physics, time doesn't really sort of exist. It, you know, and it seems that time is an illusion. And I can recommend to people, there's a wonderful British physicist named Julian Barber who has a bunch of YouTube pieces about his own ideas about what the nature of time actually is. And I had an exhibition that I actually called Platonia, which is what Julian Barber calls his, you know, universe in which time doesn't really exist, in which time is an illusion. And this is a painting called 3 Days in Summer. So again, it's stacked and in this sort of geometrical way. It's 3 different days. A small painting, it's 20 by 16 again. And that, you know, sort of stacking of images led to these kinds of paintings. This is a painting of my wife. It's called Liszki. Her name is Liszka, and it's a Polish name, and the plural would be Liszki. And this is, yeah, 3 layers stacked. Again, the more distant view is the closest, and they keep, you can see the hand in the upper left-hand corner is, you know, there's actually 4 layers. What am I saying? And those paintings then turned into these more sort of complex structures. There's a whole series of these paintings. These are 37 by 40 inch paintings. This one is called Bird Feeder. It's filling the bird feeder. Different ways. These are still painted in oil, and a fairly complex process of figuring out these paintings, because that image of her, which is a silhouette, but then you can see the mountains in the distance, had to be, those are masked, you know, and then the other image is painted on top of it. It was, you know, a lot of sketches, a lot of planning. This is another painting from that series. I started, it's called, what is it called? Roses and Gate. This is 2009, again, 37 by 40. These are still oil paint on acrylic sheet, and trying to sort of bend a layer. And this is a painting called The Dahlia Bed, Flags. And it's from 2008. And it's, again, this sort of idea of these, you know, floating layers of images that sort of wave in this sense. And this was the last of these paintings, and the first one of them that I started painting in acrylic on acrylic sheet. And it's a kind of paint that Golden Paint makes called, which is called Golden Open. And it dries slowly, not quite as slowly as oil paint, but not like acrylic, which, you know, but if you make a brush stroke, by the time you're at the end of the brush stroke, the beginning of the brush stroke is dry already. And this is a paint that you can rework. And the big benefit for me has been that it has a thinner that you can remove the paint with, but unlike the oil paint I was using, which wherever the thinner touched it, the paint was compromised and had to be removed. The thinner for this paint, once it dries again, the paint is perfectly fine. So it's a much freer, much more able to, add thinner to a part of the painting to reveal the layer underneath. And this painting is called Teresa number 43. That tells you how many of them there were. Catalogs. So it's Teresa looking through the garden catalogs, planning the garden for next year. And this is a good point to start talking about flowers. So this is a very old pastel from 1987. It's called Poppies. And flowers in my work are very much, again, about evanescence and about, things that we love that disappear. I mean, my paintings always are sort of elegies. I call it nostalgia for the present, that, I'm always sort of mourning things even while they were in front of me. The flowers are very important to me because Teresa sort of taught me, she's always been a gardener, worked in greenhouses when she was young, garden centers, and she's made this incredible garden, and flowers have become incredibly important to me as sort of signifiers of her, and for beautiful, fragile things in their own right. I think my favorite things to paint are flowers, sky, and people. So this is also a moment to bring, this is a toy theater. And part of my whole interest in layering came from, as a child, my grandfather gave me a toy theater. And I think my first real, although my father was teaching me to paint and everything, my first really, when I couldn't keep away from it, was making sets for my toy theater. So, I'd read a book and immediately, some children's book and want to make, make it happen on my toy theater. And, I'd be painting drops and sets and, one of the guests here at this is our friend Diane Rich, who was a scene painter for most of her life. So that was something we shared. But yes, it's always interested me. And one of the things about the way that I paint now, I should explain that the paintings you've been looking at so far, the stacked acrylic paintings, the layers lay flat, one on top of each other. And the paintings that are in the museum show, which is what I'm doing now, the paintings have space between them. And you can look, it's not that much room, but you can look around the edge and see into them. And I think that was always part of my interest in the toy theater and part of my fascination with it. I still love them. This one is, people, if anyone's interested, all sorts of people, if you look up toy theater, have, scanned old toy theaters and put them up on the, high resolution scans on the internet. And this one is just, printed out, cut out, and, glued together. But one of my, part of my fascination with it is that, there's this illusion from the front and you walk around the side and the illusion collapses. So again, that sort of ties into my sense that, our sense of time and everything is an illusion that, if we could go around the edge, it would collapse. So this is a recent painting of the type that are that's in the show at your museum. This one is called Evenings May over April, and it's from last May during lockdown. And I've put 3 of these paintings in here to show you the layers. So this is the finished painting. This is the layer underneath, which was painted a month before. So you can see in this layer, it's full on May, you know, the trees are leafing out, the tree, you know, everything's blooming. This is just the beginnings of that in April, early April. And then under that is an abstract painting that sort of ties into the top. And this is actually the part of the whole process that is the most difficult. The parts that are, you know, out in the landscape painting is plein air painting, and I've done it for years, and it's, you know, it's just a joy. This part is the part that, you know, what I put under all these layers is what changes everything. If this was, you know, bright green under there, the entire painting would be a different painting because there's hardly anything on these top layers. So the entire tone of the painting is made by what's on the bottom layer. So this is the part, you know, that I do over and over and over until I get what I want. This is a painting called Sassafras Morning Under Afternoon. So this is the final image. And you can sort of see, if you look closely, there's stuff happening underneath. Of course, you know, part of the problem with my work is that when you see them in person, it's pretty easy to walk up to the painting and see, you turn your head this way and that, and you see what's happening underneath. In photographs, these paintings are impossible to photograph. That's all there is to it. This is the layer that's underneath, which again is slightly closer. And the layer under that is a sort of abstract version of the whole thing. So I'll just swing back through it. That's first, that's the second layer. That's the third.
Martin, when you're painting the layers, are you often or ever like layering it while you're working on it? I mean, how do you, to key those parts?
Sometimes it's sort of a reverse thing. So I think in this one, I painted the afternoon version first, and then I painted the morning layer on top of the afternoon layer, just so I'd know where things were.
Right.
In relation to the layer beneath. Sometimes it goes the other way, but almost always I paint it just with a piece of black paper or something underneath to be the, you know, the dark tones of the painting. And then the bottom layer is always the last thing to get painted. Okay. And sometimes some of these paintings, they end up with just black underneath, which for me, I always relate to, there's a saying by the French poet Paul Valéry that God made everything out of nothing, and sometimes the nothingness shows through. And sometimes that seems like the right answer for me, you know, that it's sort of, you know, the abstract layer often for me represents some kind of other reality that's showing through what we think reality is. But sometimes I think, you know, well, maybe there's just nothingness showing through. I think the other thing I should explain while I'm showing all this is that it sounds very intellectual and very difficult and very complicated, but I always sort of liken it to playing the piano, that there's a lot going on. You know, you're counting your one melody in the left hand, one melody in the right hand. Sometimes, you know, depending on what you're playing, another melody happens in the middle. There's tempo, there's all this stuff. But for, you know, musicians, it just becomes second nature to juggle all of this. And I think, you know, for me at this point, it's all just, it's a very free thing. It's, you know, when I'm painting, I'm always conscious of what I can put underneath. if I want something to be green, I'm conscious that I can paint it yellow and stick blue under it. You know, it's all just second nature, and it's not at all complicated to do. This is sort of hot off the press. It's called Hydrangeas One Day Under Another. So again, the close-up view is in the middle there. There's an abstract painting underneath. And the layer on the bottom is frequently translucent. You can possibly sort of see that happening in there. And the frames that I frame them up in have a sheet of white plexi in the back, and the light can pass through the bottom layer and sort of bounce back. Again, just something I'm used to doing. Let me run this backwards again. So there's that. And again, if you can see, the distant view of these hydrangeas is on the top layer, and the closer up view is on the middle layer. And the layers are catty-cornered to each other. It's not a straight like this, because the plexiglass is slightly frosted, which means that the further the layer is from the layer in front of it, the more difficult it is to see it. And so I like the idea that as the layer travels from being closer to being further, it slips into more obscurity. The paintings are a lot, again, about memory. And there's something I find fascinating about the way memory seems to be tying into all these ideas about physics and time. So again, the idea of the piece slanting back and the layer slipping into obscurity the way our memories do. So these are images just to show, you know, now when I travel, I can no longer work in one layer on a flat surface. I just find it, it doesn't seem true to me. And so now when I travel, I'm stuck with traveling with, you know, plexiglass. You know, a separate bag full of plexiglass. So this is, you know, yeah, painting of Venice in 3 layers, and another one. Oh, yeah, another one. This one is called Venice, Santa Maria, 2 Evenings. This is 2 Sunsets. And this is a portrait. So this is another series of works I do, not as many as the landscapes. I've been doing portraits now for a few years. Only people I know really well, because I don't, you know, they're usually done with one sitting, and then the rest of the layers are, you know, done from photographs and memory, depending on who it is. And that's why, you know, they're only people I know, because people I know, I've been looking at their faces for years, and, you know, I sort of know what I want to do and what I want, you know, what about it is about them that I want to paint. This is a friend of ours, Alf, an English sculptor and printmaker and painter. He was actually a friend of my parents. And this was painted the Christmas before everything. We went to visit him in England for Christmas, the Christmas before lockdown. So that's when this was painted. This is our friend Sid, who's with us live tonight, I think. Painted in her garden in Philadelphia. This is Teresa. This one is 3 layers. These are small. These are like 10 by 13, which I like. The size is about the size of the head. And then I just included 3 recent paintings of flowers from this spring. Let me know if I'm going too fast. Irises, daylily. And then I'm going to wind it up with this painting. This is my studio in the country, the barn. And it's, again, this is one of the ones that has just black as the back layer, the nothingness showing through. This painting is called Lockdown Studio. And it's just all these paintings made in quarantine. Sort of, you know, yeah, building up in my studio. Here's the layer underneath. I did a series of paintings this spring which are sort of outside and inside. And this is one of them. So that's it for the slide talk. So if you have any questions. Leave.
Yeah, if anybody has a question, then you can go ahead and unmute yourself. Feel free.
Martin, I was reminded when you first started doing these, how much they affected my way of thinking about painting, but also that they had this, when you look at the new pieces that you're doing, they're a bit like a lenticular that you know, the early lenticulars that came out back in the 70s that you'd see, and you would be amazed that they were making something dimensional move on a flat surface like that.
Yes.
Now we can move around your piece and it's moving and shifting along with the light in the room.
Yes, yes. I mean, part of the again, the problem with photographing these images is because there's space between the layers. If you're seeing them in person, if you move your head even slightly, the relate where one thing sits on a layer to where it sits on the layer beneath changes, you know, changes its relationship. So yeah, it's a
That is one of the funnest things about having them, is watching people realize how much their movement affects what they're seeing, and then them getting so excited about discovering that with your pieces.
It's one of the things that I find interesting about, you know, a lot of people ask me, you know, do you paint from photographs? And I say, you know, not if I can help it. And the reason that, you know, part of it is that adrenaline rush and the excitement of being in front of something, but also it's, again, if you're painting landscape, it's very hard to tell in a photograph what's really in front of something else because you can't move your head. And the minute you move your head, you know that this branch is in front of that branch, and you know, it's the same.
Yeah.
Hi, Martin.
Hi.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes. Hi.
Okay, hi. I just have an observation about your work. And to me, this is very much what Roque artists were about because of their distortions. They would almost, I feel like when I look at like Tiepolo or I look at some of the other, even Mannerists, they're forcing you as a viewer to move in order to respond to the art. Do you find yourself considering that when you're making your work? Like, is the idea that you're creating a response on with the viewer, and the viewer has to move. It's like almost like the viewer has to dance and responds to your work. They can't just stay still. In order to experience the depth of it or understand the layers, it's like they have to go from here to there. They have to tilt their universe to see yours.
Yes, I feel strongly that paintings, in the first place is the moving back and forth, in and out, which, even, from Velázquez to Monet, there's the factor that you stand back and there's a pond and you move in and there's nothing but a bunch of scraggly brush strokes, or, or there's a princess, but you move in and again, there's nothing but, patches of paint. So that's always been a factor. And, I do feel strongly that, paintings invite you to come up to them, and when you get up to them, they should give you something.
Well, Martin, I'm John Rickrick. I visited your studio many years ago. I'm the person that Jodi took my place at the South Dakota Art Museum.
Oh, yeah.
He let me have it.
But I'm happy that you're finally exhibiting at the South Dakota Art Museum. And it was pleasant to visit your studio.
Yes, I remember.
One thing that your work kind of reminds me of the old stereoptics. The old stereopticon you look through,
Yes,
you bring the two images together. But your pieces have, much more depth, but that's what they kind of remind me of. And it's kind of interesting to see how you've gained more depth in, with the separating the plexiglass and being able to create. And I was up at the Art Museum the other day, and looking on the side of them, the plexiglass is not necessarily straight either. That it is curved in there. That kind of then adds to the dimension when you look straight on in a different way.
Yes, yeah, they're angled. It's been sort of a nightmare to get the frames made for them.
I can understand.
Yes.
Martin, I have a question, and it speaks to this issue of process and wonder, because your images are evocative of this wonder that you have for nature. But your process, from what I can observe over the years of watching you work for decades, is laborious, I think, in its touch and precision and observation, and these later paintings, the fact that it can take years before you arrive at what you consider to be the conclusion. So I was wondering if you could speak to this idea of the process and the what it takes for you to make the object and to retain the joy and wonder as it evolves.
Well, I think the joy and the wonder, when you say laborious, I don't think it's anything more laborious than any other artist's process. And I think in some ways maybe less so, because there's a lot of freedom in painting a layer and not having to know what you're doing with it, today, next month, or even next year, because some of these paintings are, painted one spring and the next spring, or, 4 springs later. So there is a certain amount of freedom in that, you don't have to know it immediately what you're doing. As I said before, the process seems like second nature to me now. The laborious part of it is the plexiglass is heavy. I'm carrying layers and layers of it around the landscape. Like any person who paints plein air, you know, the wind is trying to blow the whole thing over, and, you know, yeah, it's all of that stuff. But yeah, it doesn't, as I said before, the part that I struggle with is the part that happens in the studio, which is the bottom layer. And then,
I love hearing that, because I know that you are so fully immersed in the process. I've traveled with Martin, and I know that as the rest of us go off to look at cathedrals and markets and all of these kind of wonderful spaces, Martin finds his place, and he engages the imagery and begins this process that at sometimes he's able to finish the painting in a couple days or that day, but sometimes it may be the beginning of something that's going to take a couple years. So I'm always fascinated by that. It's more than dedication, because that sounds even trite when I think of Martin and the way he works. I always think of it as this total immersion and this total and just love and infatuation with developing this image over time, and to see what it will be, because it's not formulaic. It is about wonder. It is about seeing something evolve, and all of these aspects of it that begin to interact. And I don't even, you can't even plan that, but because of your experience, and because, you know, not to seem overly if I'm complimenting you, but this ability, this virtuosity that comes out of your ability to anticipate. And I think that that's also an important part of what's unique about your practice is I shouldn't use practice, because Martin isn't practicing, he's working. He's done with practice. That word is problematic. You know, Martin's making has just given him this not complete control, but this ability to anticipate and to use paint and color, the economy of his brush strokes that create these amazing effects, and he's got that, and it's been amazing to watch him over time. So maybe the use of the word labor is not it, it's just this is what you do, this is how I do this, and I know that I'm going to invest this much into this image, this mark, this corner of the painting, and it develops and builds until he decides or it decides it's done.
Yeah, it takes some patience.
Mm-hmm.
I think as you said, it does take planning, but, you know, I think a lot of landscape painters, you know, it becomes second nature, you know, wherever you are, you know, which way is north, which way is south, you know, how the sun is going to travel, you know, it's particularly in, you know, Croton, you know, where we are, you know, it's been, you know, most of my life there. You know, I know what tree is going to bloom when, you know, I assiduously, you know, follow AccuWeather for the week, you know, and know what day is going to be nice clouds, what day it's going to be, you know, the right day to paint a flower, when there's going to be snow. Yeah, it's, I realized that I didn't put any images of snow in here. There are some in I do have a sort of addendum at the end of this, if anybody wants to see, of 4 paintings that are in the show. Because I suddenly realized after I'd put all this together that there were going to be people joining us who hadn't seen the show. So.
Oh, and in South Dakota, we know snow.
Yes.
We do.
You know, this is a painting in the show. It's called Path, November, 3 years. So yeah, this is a 3-year painting.
You know, Martin, we do have some questions in the chat too, and maybe leading off of that last question is a good time to plug this one in.
Okay.
Somebody was wondering about whether the work, once you've put it together, is permanent, or if you could rearrange the layers, or also whether you have ever gone back and said, nope, I need to switch those.
I have indeed. And
Okay.
in fact, during this whole, quarantine and lockdown and whatever being, just, yeah, I found that a lot of paintings that I thought were done were not done, or that I hadn't pushed them far enough, or been, or, again, the thing with the bottom layers, that sometimes I haven't been adventurous enough in the bottom layer.
Sure.
They can come out of the frames, which I did. I had thought at one point of gluing them, it's like, but, for purposes of conservation and, if they need to be cleaned and whatever else, if somebody breaks the, if somebody drops it, that they can come out and go in.
Yeah. So they are built so you can unframe them and pull the pieces out.
They can't be infinitely, the frames can't be infinitely be reused, because you're screwing into the plexiglass, and eventually, that bond won't be
Right,
good.
wear and tear.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And we also had another visitor who came and asked if you ever incise the acrylic, or whether that's always just paint on the surface.
Years and years ago, I did some paintings where I incised on the plexiglass around the period of that painting that was the room with the drawings flying around, divided like a pie. Back then, I would sometimes put lines on the paintings that were simply scratched into the surface.
And you stopped doing that, why?
A lot of things that I were doing back then seemed like, to me now, like, intellectual games that I needed to maybe play then, but, didn't interest me anymore.
That's interesting. The idea of, one of the questions I have is, whether, because I'm a huge fan of transitional objects, pieces that don't fit in the category, and your work so clearly breaks categories. And so I wonder if you ever get pushback from purists who think you're not enough of a landscape painter, or you're not enough of an abstractionist yet, or if you've found your comfortable spot and you don't get flack for that, or.
I do what I do. I'm not,
Right.
I'm too old to change, but except organically. But it's actually a big problem for me. It has been over the years that people who like complicated, sort of conceptual and things that are, built up in this way, really don't like, nice landscapes and pretty flowers. And then, the people who like landscapes and pretty flowers are like, you're such a good painter. Why can't you make a normal painting? And it was, for a few years, I had a dealer in New York, who I was very fond of, who unfortunately died. I still miss him, but, and he was, an uptown, his specialty was George Bellows and, Sargent and, he showed maybe 4 contemporary artists. And, it was always a thing for him to, convince his clientele that, this was, yeah, you could.
Great work.
buy a layered painting,
Right. Yeah, I was wondering that, because I do think you cross those lines so well. That's the real appeal. But there are a lot of folks who want things in boxes, and so I can only imagine.
Or in this case, want things not in boxes.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I think what's often overlooked in work like yours, Martin, is the fact that you have such mastery of gesture.
Yeah.
Every mark of yours has like a noun and a verb. I mean, you could just, and that to me is what painting's all about, is kind of that command of each brush mark becoming that shape and that sort of unity of eye and hand coordination. And that sort of thing is kind of what excites art history. Like you go back to the caves in Lascaux, it's that gesture. You go to Tintoretto and, you know, the San Marco monastery in Venice. It is that mastery of gesture, and it's what the Impressionists were all about, and it's what Picasso was all about. And I think that's the common thread here that's often overlooked, because they're like, oh, it's a landscape. No, it's more than that. There's the hand, there's the connection, there's the depth, there's all these things, and in a way, it's almost like the subject matter is just the excuse to perform. It's like music.
Yeah.
And
yes, I mean, the musical analogy is a good one, because I often think of these. I do play, and I often think of the layers as, you know, the left hand and the right hand, you know, the bass and the treble, and, you know, that kind of rhythms, you know, happening in the bottom. But I, you know, to talk about your idea of the sort of, you know, performative aspect of, you know, your hand reacting to what you're seeing. You know, years ago when I was in therapy, my shrink who dealt mostly with performing artists and not with visual artists, you know, and she had, I think, been a dancer. And she asked me, so what is it like, you know, when you're painting a flower? And I said, well, it's like my hand is dancing with the flower. You know, that when I see something, you know, even when I'm, you know, it's, you know, when I'm sitting across the table talking to somebody, it's always, it can be a little hard, I think, for artists to concentrate on a conversation, because all the time I'm like, oh, look at the light on her forehead, and, you know, look at the, and all the time, you know, this is sort of, my hand is sort of wanting to, you know, describe that. And I think it's the same for a lot of artists.
Yeah, I do think that that's one of the really interesting about your work, because it is so painterly, even though it's such a different form of painting. You like I think it's poetic. For me, it's poetic. So you do those analogies to other forms of creative arts, but it's so painterly. The handling of the paint is just amazing in itself. Not to mention this kind of conceptual layering and breakup that brings all of these other sensibilities to the table too. And I liked seeing that too, because that immediately, those first couple slides you had shown, to me, that those were still, that poetic thread was all the way through, the sense of and value for color and light. And that sense of poetry with your imagery is so consistent, even when you were not working in this kind of format.
Yes, I mean, yeah, I mean, for me, light is what painting is about.
I think your paintings are of, I mean, every time I look at them, and they're an exploration. You're exploring the landscape. You're rather than on a flat surface, you're creating those layers. And I feel like when I, you know, view artists' work, I think about them painting it and how they may have been feeling at the time, or how much they enjoyed really getting into the painting and so on. And I think your work creates something that the viewer is able to, you know, explore your work in the depth that it has.
That is, you know, another sort of, yeah, thank you for saying that. It is a sort of firm belief of mine that, you know, paintings are not, you know, meant for Instagram. They're meant for somebody to live with. And, you know, the hope is really that, you know, someone can have a painting for 10 years and find something in it 10 years later that they never saw before.
We did have someone ask if you could go back to the floral pieces. They wanted to, somebody on Facebook wanted to see those again.
Okay. So, daylilies. This is brand new. And again, there's a closer up view of the daylily in late evening is underneath. And then the image on top is that same daylily around 1 o'clock in the afternoon. This one is called, this is also, you know, from this spring, Irises and River, 2 evenings. It's hard to see in the photograph, but there's a little bit of the river showing in the upper left-hand corner. Oh, I didn't even explain that our place is on the Hudson River, in the Hudson Valley. And you can just make out the sort of bottom of a large image of the iris showing at the bottom of the painting. And this one is tulips. And again, the closer view of the tulip head on is underneath, and these sort of ghost-like flickering images of the tulips are on top. I do also have an image of one that's in the show. If you don't get vertigo from my going too fast here.
Mm-hmm.
This is the painting of irises that's at the museum now. And again, you can see a closer up image of the irises is showing through the landscape. At the top, it's showing through everywhere.
Wonderful. You know, just so, and actually we probably could stop sharing and wrap up,
Yeah.
not to stop anybody from asking questions, but we're nearing the end. So I don't know if you can stop sharing.
Yeah, I think I can.
Okay.
If I hit escape, is that going to do the trick?
I think you have to go to screen share and stop it from there. But I was just going to add one more thing too about that, how painterly your handling of the media is, you know, which there's a lot of great painters with a lot of great facility, but when you see it condensed into one painting, you can sometimes lose the freshness of those individual brush strokes. And that's something also, especially with your layout now and how you layer those pieces of plexi at angles, you can really see those fresh, really painterly, poetic brush strokes layer by layer if you go around to the side of the painting. So I think it gives us the ability to see that painterliness a little bit better than with traditional paintings sometimes. So I really appreciate that. And I think I can, even from when I had shown your previous pieces of Teresa where they were, the pieces were more stacked flat,
Yeah.
and the frames didn't allow that view in. You know, you can see the painterliness, but you kind of lost that. The way you have it now, you can really see that on each of those layers, that handling of the paint, which is really just beautiful. And so I really appreciate that. I recognize that it allowed me to really appreciate that the way you're doing it now.
Thank you. It was a big step for me to sort of embrace the toy theater.
Sure. And, pull back the screen a little bit and invite people to peek behind the, the illusion there. Yeah. I think it's great. Yeah. And then too, in the chat box, we do have lots of thank yous from you as people were wrapping up here. So we'll have to maybe share that with you. But I think everybody really enjoyed hearing from you. I know I did. It was great to see so many more visuals too of some of those earlier pieces and how they, that evolution I think was so wonderful to get a visual for in my own head. So thank you so much. Any last questions before we wrap up? I don't want to cut it short at all, but okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for sharing your work with us at the museum.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it.
Hopefully
Thank you.
someday I'll get to meet you in person.
Yeah, well, it seems pretty close, but third time's a charm, right?
Yes. Okay.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and thank you, Martin,
Thank
for
you.
taking time out.
Great show.
Thank you. See you.
Thank you.
Bye, Diane.
Bye.
Bye, Martin.
Bye.
Mwah.
So fun.
Yeah, it's great.